Hi, and welcome back to another Grid episode. In today's episode we're going to create a really useful effect, especially if you're working in dance music or electronic music. Yeah, so as you can hear, it's a really useful effect, especially for dance music and ambient music. So this tutorial is a lot of talk regarding phase and using the sampler within the grid to create this cool shopping effect. So without further ado, let's head into the polygrid and let's get going here. So to begin with, we have the default patch with the union oscillator, but we're gonna replace this union oscillator with a sampler. So select the union oscillator and press backspace to delete the union oscillator. Then we go into the oscillator category and select the sampler and drag this out onto our workspace. Now we need some kind of a vocal sample, and if you have some kind of stem extraction application, there's free software out there. I can link them in the description here. You can always generate some music and with vocals in AI application, and then just extract the vocal stem and throw that into the sampler. But the chef always prepares, so I have a sample here, which I'm gonna include here in the course. So we're gonna use this stillness AI vocal sample. And of course we need to connect this sampler into the envelope so we can get the audio to the audio output. And we are also going to increase the sustain so we get the maximum amplitude from the envelope. And now as we press the keyboard, we're going to trigger the trigger input of the sampler, and it's going to start a playback of the audio file. Right, so by default we just have a forward playback of the sample as we press the key. And if you're not too familiar with the sampler here, we have different modes in the sampler. We have the repitch mode, cycles mode, and textures mode. And for this effect, we're just going to use the basic repitch mode, which means that we can effectively control the speed of the sample. So if I press a C2 here on the keyboard, we can almost make the sample stop if we set this to 0. We're not going to progress with the playhead. We need to have a little bit of speed, or we need to have the speed at 100% to have a normal playback. To create this vocal shopping effect that you heard in the introduction, we need some kind of control over the playhead here. Because by default here, as you can see, we just press a key and we get the playhead to progress throughout the sample at a continuous speed. By default, the sampler gives us control over the playhead, so we can control where to start the sample playback. So we can start playing at different places, but we need some kind of way to actually control the whole playback process. And to access that kind of deeper control, we need to freeze the sample. So press this little flake, this little snowflake. So now when we have that freeze position or freeze playhead active, we can actually control the playback position with either this control or the knob over here. So this gives us a complete control. You can hear we get a really glitchy kind of sound if I move the playhead between these different values. And that's because the sampler is not progressing the playhead as we hold the key. We need a continuous signal to drive this playback percentage continuously upwards. So that's our first step here, to use a phase signal to control the position of the playhead and to make the playhead progress throughout the sample. So we need some kind of a phase signal. So we're gonna go into the I/O and we're gonna drag phase input, which is the device phase. Now to proceed and working on this effect, we of course need to see the signal and see what we're doing to this phase signal. So go into display category and add the oscilloscope. And we're going to expand this oscilloscope so we have a large overview over our signal. Then we're going to drag this phase input to the input of the oscilloscope. And if you select the oscilloscope, we can also change the mode here to fast or slow. Let's set it to fast, and here we can see how the phase signal is progressing upwards, and then it resets. As I mentioned, the phase input here follows the device phase. And if you want to access and control the device phase, we can either press the device down here, so we can access the device parameters, or we can also press just outside any of the devices in the workspace, which will also give us the controls for the device. So that's like a shortcut to access the device parameters. And if you look a little bit down here, we have the device phase. It's set to length 1 and it's set to bar. So the phase here is always going to reflect one bar or one measure in our arrangement. And that's really good to know, because sometimes you might want to change this to maybe 2 bars. So we have the signal rising through 2 bars, but let's reset that to 1 bar. So now you know where to change this if you ever need to change how the device phase behaves. Right, so that's our continuous signal to begin with. And now we can just hook up this signal to control the playback. So let's go into phase again, and we're going to use a scaler. And let's take a look at what the scaler does. So we patch the phase input to the scaler input, and then output to the second input of our oscillator. So we can also see the scaling. And with the scaling, we can change this to go slower. So now this scaled signal is taking 4 times longer in its rise compared to the original signal. So we're going to use this to control exactly how fast the playback goes in the sampler. Right, so now we need to patch this signal to control the playhead of the sampler. And to do that, we're going into the I/O module palette, and we're going to select the modulator output and patch the scaler output into the modulator. Then we're going to map the modulator to the playback position like this, and just modulate maybe 18%. And let's fire away and hear how this sounds. It's a little bit high. So we can change the ratio here, and we will get a slower playback speed. Yeah, so that's how we get the phase to control the playback position. And now we need some kind of way to scramble the position while we have this continuous playback. So we're gonna manipulate this scaler output before the signal reaches the sampler playback position. So first up, we obviously need some kind of randomization module to get this random value to begin with. So go into random, and we're gonna drag this sample and hold LFO. And this device is really flexible because it gives us tons of options to control the random value behavior. And to begin with, we have at the top here a way of setting the smoothing between the random values. And we're going to add a second oscilloscope to see how the signal output of the sample and hold LFO behaves. So go into display module palette category and add a second oscilloscope. And let's increase the size of the second oscilloscope and patch the sample and hold LFO into the second oscilloscope. And there we can see the values changing along with the rate of the LFO, which is currently set to quarter notes. So every quarter note, it's gonna flip and change to a new random value. And since it's set to this 50% smoothing, you're gonna see a gradual change in position. But for our effect, we want to have an instant change, or instant data value change. So we're going to reduce this to 0 smoothness. So now we're going to see a much faster change. Select the second oscilloscope here and change it to fast, or maybe even slow, so we can see how these values are changing. Okay, so now we have this random signal, and we also have that continuously rising signal. And now the next step is to somehow merge these two signals together. So we have a continuous rising signal, but still some kind of switch to different places, but always a rising signal. Or else we wouldn't have any playback or sound from the sampler. So we're gonna merge the random signal with this continuous scalar signal. So go into the math category, and we're gonna use something called sum, which will sum two signals. So drag and patch the scalar into the sum device, and also patch the sample and hold into the sum device. And we're gonna detach the scaling output into the modulator, because now we're gonna use this summed signal as our modulation. Now we probably also want to see this summed signal and see how the signal will behave, so we can patch that into the second input of our second oscilloscope. So let's see how this sounds. Let's zoom out in the sampler a little bit so we can see how the playhead moves around here and in the sample. Maybe also reduce how the modulation affects the sample start. Just make it like 15%, maybe 13%. So now this is changing every quarter note, but let's change the sample and hold LFO to change every eighth notes. Now pay attention here to the sample and hold LFO. The second parameter is the feedback and correlation, and if this is set to a very high value, you will get very small incremental changes in the randomization, as we can see here in the oscilloscope. But if we want a larger leaps in the value changes, we need to reduce this to a lower value. And you can also hear that we get some kind of clicks if we increase the value of the smoothing, because basically the playback position is not going to move as fast, so it's going to get gradual small movements, and it's going to be a little bit more glitchy. But it can be nice to just fade in a little bit here of the smoothness from time to time. And you get the kind of scratching effect if you increase the smoothing to a very high percentage. Let's set it to 16 notes. And now we just need to find a sweet spot here with the sample start position to find the place where we get cool variations from this sample chopper. Now we can just throw on a delay here, as always, go into the effects of the polygrid and add the delay plus or any other delay, and just increase the low cut a little bit so we get less of the low end, and set it to ping pong. And if you feel that the signal is too weak, you can always add some kind of amplifier module or some kind of distortion module here between the ADSR and the audio output. So let's just do that. Go into Shaper, because that's where we have our distortion modules. And let's add the heat module. So really cool effect. So now let's just play back some drums in the background here and fire away. Right, so isn't that a really cool and useful effect? Now you can basically throw anything in this sampler, maybe some drums again like we did with the beat breaker in the previous episode, or render more different types of vocals and throw in there and see what kind of stuff you get going. Because personally I feel that this is a really useful and, again, reusable effect for basically any type of music and sound creation scenarios. Okay, so that's all for today's episode. If you have any types of questions on the episode or working with the face, just let me know in the course module or the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye!